This really has been a mess, and sorry to say it doesn't get any better from here. If you want to see the kind of bizarre mental gymnastics the religious go through, here you go. No matter how many times we point out what they're actually doing wrong, they don't listen. Why? Because they just don't care. All right, a little bit of explanation up front. Originally, I was thinking this was going to go 3 videos just based on the length, but I'm going to knock it out in 2, which means this one's going to be pretty long. You can thank me later and it'll become obvious why I'm doing it the way that I am. This time, we go through a very long video with J. Warner Wallace, and yeah, if history is any indication, Wallace isn't going to be at all impressive. I mean, he never is he? This is just fifis and faith on display, and another round of proof that Wallace must have been a crap crime scene investigator because, yeah, wow, just wow. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Anyway, after the show, I recorded a separate segment with him where I asked him about what he really thinks about the sort of contempt for testimonial evidence that is prevalent among internet skeptics. And here was his response.
Just as a reminder, because some of this was in the last video, he's talking about J. Warner Wallace, and we're going to get into that in a second. But you'd think that someone who was a former crime scene investigator and cold case detective, he would know what a crapshoot individual testimony actually is. People lie. People make mistakes. Memory doesn't work well over the long term. Your brain starts to forget, and then it just invents details to fill in all the holes. As soon as your short-term memory transfers to the long-term memory system, you're already starting to forget details. It's as good as the last time that you recalled the memory from the archives, and your brain isn't telling you what you actually experienced, just the parts that it recalled, plus all of the things that it's just filled in to make it seem coherent. There was a study done around the time of COVID where workers at a hospital were asked to recall training procedures about fitting masks. Within 1 year, 76% of respondents made serious errors in their recollections. The overall idea was basically fine, but the fine details had already faded into obscurity. Now, remember, in the case of the supposed apostles, that the earliest accounts in the Bible was written no less than 30 years later, and most of them far later than that. Memory, at least accurate memory, it just doesn't last that long. And that's why it's the least reliable form of evidence in the courtroom, and Jimmy Boy ought to know that. And that's why that it must be independently corroborated by evidence, which he just doesn't have.
An atheist slogan that often appears on the internet, popular skeptics like Matt Dillahunty, and then there's this YouTuber called Apologia, if you're aware of, they often poke fun at Christians with this Bible says so jingle. So what they basically say is that claims are not evidence. So when you look at the Gospels, they're just a bunch of claims. He said, she said, but they do not really constitute evidence.
And that is true, because the writers of the Gospels are entirely anonymous. They were not demonstrable eyewitnesses. They were not the people whose names Papias eventually stapled onto their accounts. So the whole question of memories is irrelevant in that particular situation. It doesn't matter what you want to be true, only what you can actually demonstrate is. Therefore, this is completely off the rails before they even begin. A legitimate example of, "For the Bible tells me so." They're just believing it blindly because they really wish that's what was true. But that doesn't mean that it is. It means absolutely nothing of the sort. So let's see what J-Dubs has to say. I can already guess it's going to be pretty irrational.
Now, as someone who as a part of your profession, is known for assessing testimonial evidence. So you know what is just a claim and what claims actually constitute as evidence. And a former atheist as well. So you applied the very same skill set to the Gospels. How do you look at the claims of the Gospel, and how can we actually filter it to know whether it actually amounts to be testimonial evidence?
Or at least I thought we would, because I'd hoped that Wallace would be better at it than he seems to be in his religious life. Anyone who just blindly believed what they were told because it fit into a preconceived narrative like he does, I'd hope the police departments of the world would just toss his ass out into the street right quick. But let's hopefully hear it from his own lips. J-Dubs, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, so a couple of things. It's true that if what you mean by claims, you mean I would agree that unsubstantiated claims are not evidence. They're just a claim.
Thus, the claims in the Bible, yeah, you know. So next, we have to ask, how have these claims been actually substantiated? Now, I figure he's going to try to explain that in a second, or maybe not, I don't know. But in either case, it's not going to work for him because, as I said before, none of the authors of the Gospels were actual demonstrable eyewitnesses. Paul certainly wasn't. He had a drug trip on the road to Damascus, and he never claimed to have seen anything that was objectively real. His Jesus was a spiritual Jesus, not one that rose from the dead. Once you discard faith and fifis, you're down to absolutely nothing. He's going to have a lot more than that to go on. And I think we all know that he's not going to.
And people can claim all kinds of things. But when you're working with witnesses, all you have are the claims of witnesses. The question is, what makes the claim substantiated?
Good question. It's just too bad that you're not working with demonstrable eyewitnesses then, isn't it? Because this is where one of many places that he's just going to go wrong. I don't care what you believe. I care what you can prove, and yeah, good luck on that. This is exactly why I have so little respect for Wallace, because his entire shtick is that he once solved cold cases, and this is just crap. It is utterly embarrassing. So yes, I agree, people can claim anything, and in religious circles, we know that people have a vested interest in making emotionally comforting claims that may or may not be true, but he has absolutely no one or nothing to cross-examine. He can't prove that any of these people were there, and without that, what's he got? Nothing. Nothing at all. It's not like he can walk into a courtroom and say, well, these people were witnesses. I can just feel it. He'd just get laughed out on his ass. So here comes another chance to make a good impression. Don't blow it.
How do I know if the claim is true? Like, is there some way to confirm the reliability of the claim? Of course, that's what we're trying to do, right?
Well, it should be. Now, how do you propose to do that with anonymous documents and a crime scene that's been cold for 2,000 years? That's an honest question. How do you do that? Because you don't get to use faith or hunches or whatever else to come to a conclusion that supposedly has to be based on evidence. You actually have to have evidence, and sadly, J. Warner Wallace has absolutely nothing. This just isn't going to go well for him.
Someone could come in and make a claim, and the two people make claims, but until one is substantiated in some way, in other words, I can come in and say I could claim that the sun set tonight at 6 p.m. That's a claim. It's not evidence. Well, I saw it set at 6 p.m. Well, how do I know you're telling me the truth? You could be lying. It's just a claim.
Sure, but we do have astronomical data that would support it. All we have to do is verify where you were, look up the appropriate charts, and we could see if the sun did in fact set at the time that you reported that it did. That's corroboration. What do you have for this Jesus story? Absolutely nothing remotely of the sort. In fact, the claims that we do have, and that is all that they are, unsupported, uncorroborated claims, they don't match up with the details that we actually do know or that we think we know. They don't even agree with each other on a lot of factors. You are just digging the hole deeper, pal. I hope that you don't think anybody's going to be impressed, at least not anybody with the brain.
Well, then you go back and you do some, maybe I've got the National Weather Service that has a marker here, just down the street. And sure enough, it measures that it's dark at 6 o'clock. So now I've got some independent corroboration of the claim. And that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for a way to turn a claim into a substantiated claim, a claim that's supported by other forms of evidence. And it doesn't need to be a lot. It could just be one other touch point piece of corroboration.
Notice that he's not talking about the Jesus claims, right? I mean, he doesn't have to. That wasn't brought up in the question, but I think we all know pretty much what was intended. So I'm going to let him get to his example in a second, but let me ask you this first. Is anybody out there impressed with this at all? I mean, he's right as far as it goes, but you can't just apply this to his religious beliefs without significant asterisks attached. This methodology is completely different than any other system that would be applied to the real world. Believe it at your own risk.
So for example, I always say it this way. He came in the bank and he jumped over the counter and he took that money and left.
Okay. Now, presumably, there are cameras, so you wouldn't need any of these eyewitnesses, but let's assume for the moment that there weren't. Let's assume that it was just this guy standing in the bank. No tellers, no nothing. He claims that somebody came into the bank, vaulted over the counter, and emptied out the cash drawers. Should we believe him? No, not necessarily. What if this guy is the robber? What if he's just telling this story as a means to avoid being caught? That's a fair point that people really need to deal with, and while with actual crime scene investigators they probably would once you have actual corroboration, then the witness testimony really doesn't mean much, does it? So let's think about this rationally. The way that J. Warner Wallace isn't doing.
Well, that's your claim. It's not evidence. Well, it's a witness in a crime. He says he saw it. And you're just going to say his eyewitness claim is just a claim. It doesn't count as evidence, just a claim. Well, if somebody else says, yeah, I saw it too, is it more than a claim now?
Maybe. Maybe they're accomplices. Now, I know this is just a simple, stupid example on his part, and I'm just out there punching a bunch of holes, but this is how people need to think. The claims never become good evidence. They always remain claims. Maybe they can back up other evidence that's been found on the scene. Maybe they can be corroboration for something else that's been discovered at the site, but they should never, ever, ever be believed as the sole evidence because it's way too easy for them to be wrong. Memory, as I said before, even if people are telling the truth, which you can't assume, memory is never, ever perfect. In fact, most of the time, it isn't even very good. There are lots of examples out there. In fact, there are professors that purposely run experiments on their students to show this, with imaginary robbers running into the classroom, and then the professor asks everybody to describe what they saw. It was just mere moments ago. They were all demonstrably sitting right there. It actually happened. But the answers are always varied. Why? Because memory sucks.
Well, it's still a claim, but now it's a corroborated claim, but it's still another witness. Okay, tell you what, we found a palm print on the desk that he jumped over allegedly, according to the witnesses. Well, that's about where a palm would go if he was jumping over the way they said. So now the palm print acts as a corroboration to the claim of the witness. This witness is starting to look like she's legit now.
Depends on the evidence. I'd be testing the witness's palm print if I was you, because you never know. And you might say, oh, well, you just don't trust anybody. Well, no, not really, not in that line of work if I was part of it. And if you're in the business of solving crimes, you shouldn't trust anyone either. That's kind of the point. But we are getting away from the real question here, and that's the reliability of testimony, and I've shown a ton of different reasons why it, in and of itself, just doesn't mean anything. It's just a claim, and without some way to back it up, it is less than empty. And back to the whole Jesus story, since that's really what we're here for, we have absolutely no corroboration whatsoever to offer for any of the anonymous writings of, well, who the hell really knows? And that's kind of a problem, isn't it?
Because an unsubstantiated claim, I'm always going to be skeptical of. You should be too.
Except you're not, as I've already showed. The religious just don't think that way. They believe because they want to, not because they have solid evidence offered in support of their faith. I'm the one thinking like a crime scene investigator here. He sure isn't. Or if we look at, say, Lee Strobel, I'm the one thinking like an investigative journalist. These people, they're just a bunch of gullible gets.
But as we start to begin to build corroboration for the claim is no longer unsubstantiated. Now it's corroborated by something, and that corroboration can be very, very small. So the palm print, for example, is not going to tell you what the witness said he saw. What the witness said, well, he was wearing a tan shirt and black pants. Well, that palm print confirms that somebody jumped over. The guy he said jumped over did jump over, but it doesn't corroborate what he was wearing.
Again, assuming that they're telling the truth, and you have absolutely no way to gauge that without taking every bit of their testimony and being able to back each part up. But let's not forget what's really being discussed here. We come right back to the anonymous Gospels and zero corroboration for anything that they say. There is no way to get around that, and I'm sure the hell not going to stop bringing it up. You also have to remember that a bank robbery is a very mundane claim. Banks get robbed all the time. How many people have we seen rise from the dead? Zero. So claims about someone rising from the dead or doing miracles or whatnot, take your pick, those are going to require a whole lot more corroboration than some guy with a gun in a bank. It's one thing that the religious will never admit to. Mostly, I think, because they know it's just going to make them look dumb.
So in other words, we take touch point corroboration to infer reliability to the larger witness, the larger reliability to the witness. And that's fair. We do this all the time. So to say that a claim is not evidence would be to say, well, is an eyewitness claim evidence?
If it's a demonstrable eyewitness, one that you can show that they're telling the truth, that their particular version of events can be corroborated such that it matches other evidence that can be known to be true, that doesn't rely on memory or individual biases or whatever, yeah, then maybe, I guess. I wouldn't be putting anyone behind bars for that, and I certainly wouldn't be accepting any supernatural claims for that. Like I said, testimonial evidence is the least reliable you can find. And it's something that the religious don't even have.
Well, it depends, I guess, on who is making the case. Because often we'll see that from the other side that, yeah, they'll take one expert, one scientist who says, yeah, look, I see that this, and suddenly it's gold. But if my scientist says the opposite, well, your scientist is an idiot, right? It's just a claim over there. Over here, somehow it's evidence. Well, a lot of it's going to come down to which of these two claims can we actually support evidentially through some other form of corroboration.
That's kind of the point. Science, by its very nature, relies on supporting evidence. A hypothesis doesn't become a theory unless it's backed up by testing, observation, and demonstration. So if a scientist just says something, the 9 out of 10 dentists say they like Star Wars, that doesn't actually mean anything. That's kind of what happens on the creationist side. Well, because we already accept these supernatural claims on faith, therefore God done it. Have any of those supernatural claims ever been shown to be true, independently and with evidence? No, of course they haven't. Your beliefs and your faith just don't mean anything. Why can't they figure that out?
So in that sense, yes, I agree that claims by themselves, unsubstantiated, are just unsubstantiated claims. But once we begin to corroborate them, they take on evidential power.
Interesting. So when you talk about the Gospels, you have these different claims, and also, just an additional question with that, that you see some, uh, amongst themselves, they kind of deviate on some details, right?
Sure.
So when you look at testimonial evidence, is that also expected?
What testimonial evidence? I mean, that you can prove. Because he's just doing what I just said he would. He's taking his beliefs, assuming that they're already automatically true, and they're just running on that basis, as if he's already demonstrated it somehow. Funny, I must have missed that part. Can we back up and show it to me again? How have you demonstrated that, for example, Matthew, the real human being that was a disciple of Jesus, wrote Matthew? How do you do that? Walk me through the steps. And that's the problem here, because they can't. We all know they can't. All they can do is make an assertion. Therefore, without some kind of objective corroboration for the claim, we cannot accept the claim as valid. Your faith doesn't mean anything. Just because you really want it to be true, that doesn't matter. And here we are seeing the kind of absurd confirmation bias that the religious always engage in action. It's only a claim until it's corroborated. But the Gospels, that's got to be true, no support required. Tell me you are not seeing the same thing. Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. Let's say someone's watching this video, the two of us. Turn off the video, turn off the, where it's posted, and now we're going to interview. What did Jim talk about? And I'm just going to have you say what Jim talked about. And you're going to say what Jim talked about. And you're going to say what Jim talked about. I guarantee you there'll be some sense that, did you all watch the same thing? Because you're not going to mention the same things. You're going to end up being focused on the things that were interesting to you. And that's natural. This is what happens with every eyewitness. And what happens is not just that I'm only going to repeat back what's interesting to me. It's that my tunnel vision in real time is only going to allow input about what's interesting to me.
And there's religion for you. You couldn't describe it better if you tried, because you see exactly what Wallace is doing here, what I've pointed out time and time again that the religious do. Well, you can't do that, only to run back to it the second that you get to something you just want to believe, because it strokes their emotional ego. Yet, that doesn't matter, does it? He said so himself. You remember the things that appeal to you. Like all the crap in the Bible. They like that idea. They believe that idea. That idea is comforting. And therefore, that idea just has to be true. No support required. So where is that corroboration that Wallace is talking about? It's nowhere to be found.
So if I said to you, what was behind him to his left? Some people will know because that was interesting to them. Some people will say, I don't remember, because I was focused on his face, So it's going to depend on what it is you are focused on in real time. And that even varies witness to witness. So don't be surprised when you have variations.
Which is true. Eyewitness testimony does have some inherent problems, which again is why it is the least reliable thing that you can have. So why is this a problem for the Bible? Because you don't even have demonstrable eyewitnesses to talk about. You have anonymous authors engaged in a decades-long game of telephone, telling stories, redacting previous gospels, providing contradictory information, and it is Wallace's job as a paid religious shill to figure out how to spin it so the people who are buying his books and going to his lectures, they don't get up and leave. A lot of people object to me putting it like that, but too bad. That is what is demonstrably going on. That is how these people make a living, getting up there night after night after night, telling the same carefully written stories that have evolved over time because they're just more effective that way. It's why these people have scripts. They don't just shoot from the hip. Try talking to an established apologist sometime, and they'll go to absurd lengths just to get back to the narrative that repetition has made them comfortable with. This isn't about truth. It's about comfort and money. You can't forget the money.
It doesn't mean that this is a lie, that anyone's lying. Every one of those people saw the video, but they're all going to recall it slightly differently. And that's what we see in any set of eyewitness testimony. So in the end, what we're trying to do is to be able to and by the way, what would count as corroboration? How about this? The reason why I wrote person of interest is I wanted to be able to say, look, of the two possibilities that Jesus is just a work of fiction, do you think the work of fiction? Can you think of any other example in which a work of fiction changed history?
The fiction didn't change history. All of the people who believed the work of fiction did. There was no corroboration. Nobody was testing the crap in the Bible. They just wanted it to be true. And then they just ran around with swords and knives and killed the people who didn't buy into it hook, line, and sinker. They forced it on others through force of law, through force of arms, through social indoctrination. And if you force a lie on others for long enough, it becomes largely indistinguishable from the truth. But that doesn't make it the truth, though. We're right back to square one. Demonstrate that this crap is true. No faith, no beliefs, no wishful thinking. Produce your demonstrable evidence that shows that any of this ever happened. And it's right around there that they're just going to uproot the goalposts and go running around. Oh, well, you just have to throw out some of the other historical things, too. Okay, fine. Throw them away. One standard, remember? The second that you don't fall for that, they just run for the hills because they can't meet the standards that exist. They don't care. They don't even try. It is just so easy to prove how irrational they are. Just talk to them. That's all it takes.
And catalyzed literature, music, art, education, and even seeped into every other world religion.
Tell that to the Hindus, who predate your silly beliefs by a pretty significant margin. Tell that to the ancient Egyptians. They'd laugh if they were still around. Buddhism has been around since at least 500 BCE. I mean, Christianity didn't influence the Jews, did it? It was more the other way around. Zoroastrians were around long before Christianity. So were the Jains. So was Confucianism. Exactly what world religions is he talking about? Scientology? It just sounds like he yanked it straight out of his ass, doesn't it?
If so, can you tell me who that is? You're not going to find anybody. Therefore, it's a reasonable inference of if it's either a person who is historical or a person who's fictional. Of those two options, it seems to me that even the impact that Jesus had in history inclines me more toward corroborating his historicity than his fictional nature.
Welcome to false dichotomy theater, because there are other options. You know, like Jesus was a real person or a collection of real people upon whom myths were posthumously draped. That's a really good option that he doesn't want to talk about, right? Or that it was just a load of stories that blew up way out of proportion over time. I talked about people seeing Elvis the same day that he died, and by the time that he'd been gone for a year or two, stories of him still being around were everywhere. The World Weekly News used to put that on the cover a lot, that and Bat Boy. Now, Elvis was real, we can demonstrate that, but that doesn't mean that any of these stories ever happened. They were just people who really wanted to believe that Elvis was still around. But that doesn't make it so. Not for Elvis and not for Jesus. You have to do better than that.
And if you can go one step farther, do you think that what other mortal human have you ever seen have this kind of impact in history?
Like I already said, it wasn't Jesus that had any demonstrable impact. It's the crazy people who followed those stories. Jesus didn't demonstrably do anything. Now, can we find people who have had a serious impact on their followers? Easily. Muhammad, there's an entire religion based around him and his teachings. Buddha, same thing. Hell, Jim Jones, 900 people died. I'd say that's a pretty serious impact. Or David Koresh, 76 Branch Davidians down. At least those people we can prove were real, for the most part at least, and we can't do any of that with Jesus. Popularity doesn't equate to truth. That's a fallacy, whether you like it or not.
Well, tell me who that would be. You won't find it. Then it's a good reason. Given the two choices, he's just a man who got dumb lucky, or he's something more than human. Doesn't this kind of corroboration from history even speak more to the second reasonable possibility?
Not even remotely. This is an argument for consequences of sorts, where he's arguing from what happened back to what he wants to believe. It isn't true just because things went down that you really like. You actually have to back it up, and he's not even trying. Because, as we all know, these people just don't care. They are starting with a conclusion, reach for emotional reasons, and then just running around cherry-picking arguments and factoids that support their side, while ignoring the overwhelming majority of data points that they don't like. We are not seeing the evidence to support it. They're just leaping to conclusions with zero corroboration. Kind of sad, huh?
So I think in the end, there's a way in which this type of evidence even adds to our case. And that's all I'm trying to say in the book, is that the case for the historicity and deity of Jesus is made even more powerful, because I would not toss out the New Testament. I want that in. But even if you weren't willing to look at it, you'd still be stuck with the same Jesus.
And what Jesus is that exactly? And I mean demonstrably. Because you might be able to get to a real human person if you squint just right, and you really can't even do that. But that's not the Jesus that they're talking about. You know absolutely nothing about any real individual because the entire Jesus story has been all completely mythologized. But of course, I would be fine assuming that there was some kind of kernel of truth at the center of all the myths. We'd never find out what it is, not demonstrably, but if you want to assert that, yes, there might have been a guy, I'd be fine with that. Now, how do you get beyond that? You can't, at least not without faith. And faith doesn't mean anything. And I know that's hard for the religious to hear, but it's true. Faith is utterly irrelevant. Faith doesn't get you anywhere worthwhile. It just strokes childish egos, and if that's what you're trying to do, then you are not on the same intellectual plane with the rest of us. Come on back when you grow the hell up. We'll wait, I guess.
So in a nutshell, corroborated claims are evidence. Archaeologically speaking, time and again, several claims and objections that have been raised by skeptics once upon a time have been discarded. In fact, as historians would tell you, every major town or city mentioned in the Gospels and the Book of Acts have been unearthed, and several villages as well.
The existence of New York City doesn't prove that Spider-Man is real. None of that matters. The fact that Tokyo is there, that doesn't prove Godzilla. The Devil's Tower is a real place in Wyoming. That doesn't mean that aliens made contact there, as in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The list goes on and on and on. It doesn't matter how much you wish that these things proved your crazy beliefs. They just don't. Stop making a fool of yourself.
So the archaeological data, the secular sources that emerge from that era are also consistent with the Gospels. Well, what happens when these skeptics, say Matt Dillahunty, are confronted with corroborations that cannot simply be mocked away? Well, we will see one such case in an upcoming video. This is Asher John for the Carpenter's Desk.
Now, I haven't seen his next video, and yeah, who knows? If you want me to take a look at it, let me know in the comments. But judging just by what I've seen in this video, I am not hopeful that any of this is going to be worthwhile. I've already pointed out just how nonsensical all of this is. It's just confirmation bias, not demonstrable truth. They just want it to be true, but they can't demonstrate that it is, and it's the demonstration that actually matters. Your faith is meaningless, and these people can't figure out the proper steps that they would have to go through in order to get to a demonstrable God. Because you can't just back yourself into a corner and declare, God done it, because it's the only idea that you happen to like. Yet, that's pretty much all that they're doing, right? I don't know what to tell you people, but That's stupid. It just is.